Take your dog and get out. My son jabbed a finger toward the front door, while Rain hammered the moiseaux. His wife cradled their baby and looked at me with contempt. You've been a burden long enough. Then my son grabbed my old dog by the collar and hauled him across the hardwood floor, shoving him out into the storm. I quietly picked up my suitcase clipped on the leash and walked out without a word. 48 hours later, a silver-haired lawyer set a document down on the table in front of me. When my son reached the final page, he stumbled backward and whispered, "No, this can't be happening." Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, a place where the truth has a way of finding its footing, no matter how long it's been buried. If something here speaks to you, tap subscribe so the next story comes straight to you when it's ready. Before we go any further, I'd love to know what's the weather like where you're sitting today. Somehow it always feels right to know who's out there listening and whether the cold is settling in the way it does in this story. One more thing, some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it, and that part is as real as it gets. A brief note before we begin this story draws on fictional elements shaped for both entertainment and reflection. Names and places are invented, but the truths running through it are real enough to keep. I have endured brutal winters in Avery County. I have lowered my wife into the ground with these very hands. There were years when fever and a broken back were just the cost of showing up, and grocery money got counted out in quarters. But none of it, nothing across 72 years of hard living, landed the way those 5 words did. Take your dog and get out. Spoken in my son's voice. My Aaron, the same boy I'd held upright through ear infections at 2 in the morning. The boy whose entire life fit in the bed of my pickup when I drove him 400 miles to start college. That voice cold and flat as pavement in January, telling me to clear out of a house I'd helped put a roof over. Let me bring you back to that night. October, Charlotte. Rain that doesn't come down so much as drive sideways at you, the kind that finds every gap in your collar before you've even thought to pull it up. I'd been upstairs in my little room on the 2nd floor, stretched out with an old Zane gray paperback Buck dozing at the foot of the bed. Buck is my golden retriever, 11 years old. Muzzle gone silver, not as quick on his feet as he was, but never more than a room away from me, like I'm the one steady thing in his universe. That night, he turned restless, scratching at the door. I figured the yard was calling, so I let him slip out. Should have walked with him. Maybe 10 minutes passed before Celeste's voice came punching up through the floorboards, pitched high and tight, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to reach bone. Oh my God, Aaron. Aaron, get in here right now. I was already moving down the staircase before she said his name again. I rounded the corner into the living room, and there was Buck, halted at the edge of the rug, paw's muddy tail, clamped low ears, pressed flat. He'd nosed his way back in through the rear door I'd left unlatched. The yard had turned to mud. His feet showed it. That was the sum of it. That was the entire offense. Celeste had pressed herself against the couch, clutching baby Owen to her chest, like Buck had come through the door, on his hind legs swinging a torch. Owen was 8 months old, rosy and completely unbothered face tipped sideways against her shoulder. That animal almost jumped on my baby, she said, her voice breaking apart at the seams. Celeste, he's over by the door, I told her, steady as I could manage. He never went near Owen. Don't you stand there and tell me what he did or didn't do. I watched it happen. Her jaw was locked, eyes lit up. This is exactly what I've been saying. Day after day, something with that dog fur on the cushions, mud on the floors, and now this. I crouched down and went to work on Buck's paws the way I always had. Palms gentle, patient. Buck licked once at my wrist, still shivering faintly from the wet. I'll get it cleaned up, I said. 5 minutes, that's all. That's when Aaron came in from the hallway, still dressed from work slacks on collar button, loose something amber in a glass. He took in the floor, took in Buck, took in Celeste. Something moved between the two of them. I didn't see it pass so much as feel the weight of it settle behind my ribs. Celeste angled herself toward him and dropped her voice not quite far enough. I can't go on like this, she said. I mean it, Aaron. I am done. Aaron placed his glass on the entry table without a sound. His eyes didn't come to me yet. He pressed his hand to the back of his neck, working his jaw like a man swallowing something bitter before he can speak. Dad, flat. Not hot, not sharp, flat. And I have learned that flat is the hardest to bear. Anger still means there's something alive in a person. Flat means they've already gone somewhere you can't follow. I think it's time we address the living situation. The living situation, I said back. It's not working out. He met my eyes at last. His were worn red at the edges. Celeste and I have a new baby. We need room to breathe. We need this house to feel like ours. My hand stilled on Buck's paws. I always understood this was my home too, son. Celeste let out a sound from somewhere in her throat. Not a laugh, not quite a scoff either. Something that cut deeper than either one. Aaron, her voice carried that particular stillness, the kind that tells you the verdict came down hours ago, and what's happening now is just the reading of it. Go ahead and do what we talked about. He crossed to the hall closet. Hangers scraped against the rod. He returned a moment later with my old blue suitcase, the one I'd filled with everything I carried out of Avery County, and placed it beside the front door. Didn't pitch it. Set it down with care, like a man who'd rehearsed the motion. Dad, take your dog and get out. His gaze dropped to the floor as the words left him. I won't spend another day under the same roof as a stubborn old man and that animal. The temperature in that room seemed to fall around what he'd said. I rose to my feet slowly. My knees popped the way they do whenever the air turns damp. I studied my son's face, truly studied it, hunting for the boy who used to go slack with sleep on long rides home. His head tipped against the passenger window, breath ghosting the glass. He wasn't there. Celeste had already pivoted away, smoothing Owen's blanket as though what had just happened was settled. Business settled well before I'd walked into the room. I moved to the suitcase. My hands did not shake. I need you to hear that. 72 years old, breathing in the rain damp of a house I'd helped purchase, and my hands held steady. I unhooked Buck's leash from beside the door. Come on, buddy, I said quiet. Buck came straight to me. He leaned his whole weight into my leg, warm and certain. In that moment, I felt a gratitude toward that dog I couldn't have put into language. I pushed the front door open. The rain came for us at once, cold and absolute, driving through my flannel in seconds. Suitcase in one hand, leash in the other, I walked off the porch of that house and didn't turn around once. The door found its frame behind me. No slam, just the small final sound of a latch engaging. I stood on the front walk in the dark and the downpour, 72 years old, with maybe $35 in my shirt pocket and a phone at 8% battery. Buck pressed into my leg and looked up rain, flattening his golden coattail, moving slow but steady. I know, boy, I said. I know. Where we'd go, I had no answer. How the night would resolve itself, I couldn't say. What I did know standing in that Charlotte dark was this. The real story didn't begin that night. It reached back much further. If you want to make sense of how a father winds up out on the sidewalk in the rain, locked out of his own son's life, you have to start at the root. To feel the full weight of what that night cost me, you have to know where I grew up. Not Charlotte, not wide boulevards and lit-up skylines and blocks full of houses built to signal something. I mean Avery County, North Carolina, back roads and ridgelines and October wood smoke riding the air, a place that judged a man by what his hands could make, not by what his wallet could pull out. My father was a coal miner, 6 days a week, underground coming home, wearing the dust of it. When the mines began shutting down in the early 80s, the county hollowed out alongside them. Men who'd known nothing but that dark grinding work were suddenly left with idle hands and nowhere to put them. Some reached for the bottle. Some planted themselves on their porch steps and stared at the ridgeline like it owed them an explanation. I reached for a chisel. 28 years old, I built my first proper piece, a rocking chair cut from a red oak I'd taken down myself on our back lot. Lorene stood on the porch one Saturday afternoon and watched me work the sandpaper over it. Little Aaron, riding her hip, maybe 18 months already, grabbing at anything in range. Walter Pruitt, she said from the doorframe, tilting her head at me. You talk to that wood like it understands every word. Maybe it does, I said. I dragged my thumb along the grain, hunting for any place I'd been careless. Wood doesn't lie to you. Work it right, it tells you. Cut a corner, it tells you that too. She let out that laugh of hers, the one that welled up from somewhere deep and worked its way to the surface unhurried. You do realize you just described yourself. I looked over at her. The afternoon sun was angling through the pines, catching the dust motes spiraling up off the chair. Lorene had that look she got, sometimes tender and faintly sorrowful together, like she could already see around a bend in the road I couldn't make out from where I stood. You're going to be all right, old man, she said softly. And so is this family. I believed her. In those days, I believed everything Lorene told me. Those were lean years. Lord, were they lean. The kind where you teach yourself to pull a truck engine apart at midnight, Because a mechanic's bill isn't something the budget will hold. The kind where Lorene stretched a pot of chicken soup across 3 days and made it feel each time like she'd just finished cooking it fresh. Aaron grew up on that soup in that little house that carried the smell of sawdust and pine resin and Lorene's coffee brewing on the stove before first light. But Lorene's lungs were never quite right. It began as a winter cough that wouldn't release its grip. Then it became a year-round thing. The doctor over in Spruce Pine used words I had to go track down at the library. Chronic, inflammatory, progressive. He said old damp houses only made it worse. He said she needed medication we couldn't reliably afford. I started accepting every job that came my way. Cabinet fronts, barn doors, church pews, fence posts. In winter I worked by flashlight bent over the bench behind the house, breath pluming out into the cold while I raced to finish orders. Aaron used to slip out there and perch on a stool in the corner, just watching. "Dad, how come you always smell the wood before you do anything else?" He asked me one evening. He couldn't have been older than 7. Pajamas with little tractors on them, socks with holes in the heels. "Because each piece talks different," I told him. "Oak smells like rain. Pine smells like Christmas morning. Cherry smells almost sweet, like something worth waiting for is on its way." I held out a scrap of cherry wood toward him. "Here, tell me what you get." He pressed it against his nose and scrunched his whole face into concentration, the way only children can manage. "Like Grandma's kitchen." I laughed hard enough that I had to set my chisel down. "Yeah, son, just exactly like that." Those were the moments I held on to through the difficult years. Not the unpaid bills, not the nights the heat gave out. Those quiet hours in the workshop, my boy on his stool, learning to trust what his hands could make. When his teachers started calling him gifted, I wasn't sure what to do with the word. Then his high school principal, a plain-spoken woman named Mrs. Weston, sat me down in her office and delivered it straight. "Mr. Pruitt, your son has a mind that has no business staying in a county with hollowed-out industry. He belongs at a university." I drove home that afternoon and settled into the workshop for a long stretch palm, moving over the surface of an unfinished tabletop, just thinking. Lorene found me there after supper. She came and sat on the old stool Aaron always claimed and folded her hands in her lap. "You already know what you're going to do," she said. "It's a lot of money, Lorene." "It's his life, Walter." And that settled it. I worked double shifts from Aaron's sophomore year, clear through his senior year. Lorene made every dollar I brought home stretch like it had no business stretching. No vacations, no new furniture. We drove the same truck until rust ate through the floorboards, and I welded a patch on by hand. The morning I took Aaron up to the University of North Carolina, I helped him haul 2 bags and a box of books up to his dormitory room. His roommate had already moved in music coming from a small speaker on the desk. Aaron turned and looked around at everything, the cinder block walls, the narrow mattress, the window looking out over the quad, and his face did something I will never lose. It opened like a window thrown wide on the first real morning of spring, after a winter that's gone on too long. "Dad," he said, turning toward me, eyes lit, "I'm actually going to do this." "I know you are," I said. I pulled him in one firm embrace, the way Pruitt men hug brief, but with everything behind it. Then I picked up my keys and went back down to the truck alone. I didn't linger to watch him unpack. I stood beside the truck in the lot for a while, eyes moving up the face of the building, locating his window. I could just make out his shape moving around inside, already in the business of becoming someone else. Pastor Hale, my oldest friend back in Avery County, had told me once, "Walter, the hardest part of loving a person well is knowing when to step aside and let them leave you behind." Standing in that parking lot, those words finally made sense. I climbed into the truck. I drove the 4 hours back to Avery County by myself. The seat next to me stayed empty the whole way, and the cab held the smell of the pine boards I'd lined it with years ago. I found a country station and let the road unspool beneath me. I thought I was doing the right thing. I told myself the empty seat meant I'd finished the work a father is supposed to do. I had planted something, watered it, watched it climb toward a sky I could barely see from ground level. And I told myself, that was enough for any man. What I didn't understand yet was that some trees grow so tall, they stop remembering what soil they rose from. The rain had soaked clean through my flannel shirt all the way to skin. My back ached in that familiar way it does in the cold, a deep grinding pressure that builds at the base of the spine and travels upward like a slow-moving fire. Buck was jammed against my left leg, trembling his wet fur cold beneath my hand. I kept stroking him anyway, more for my own sake than his, if I'm telling it honestly. I had maybe $35 in my shirt pocket and 8% battery on a phone with nobody obvious to call. That's when Clifford Davenport's face surfaced in my mind. Funny what rises up when everything else clears away. 30 years vanished, and the man was right there, as vivid as the afternoon he first pulled up to my workshop. In a truck that looked like rust was the only thing holding the frame together. It was 1993. Clifford Davenport was 35 years old, running a small furniture operation out of a rented warehouse off South Tryon Street in Charlotte. He'd made a 2-hour drive to find me after someone at a trade show passed along my name. His company was bleeding out one bad contract, one rough season, and he was staring at bankruptcy. He walked into my workshop, moved through it, slowly ran a hand down the length of an unfinished oak sideboard I'd been nursing along for a week, and said the thing that made me trust him on the spot. "You don't make furniture," he said. "You make things that outlast people." "Most things do," I told him. "People aren't put together as well as they once were." He laughed a genuine laugh, not the polite variety. We shook hands right there in the sawdust. I spent 3 weeks on that commission. A complete dining set table, 6 chairs a sideboard, all in quarter, sawn white oak, hand-cut dovetail joints on every single drawer. Lorene thought I'd gone sideways, burning through nights until 1 and 2 in the morning, knuckles cracked, eyes raw. "Walter, you're going to drive yourself into a hospital bed," she told me one night, appearing in the workshop doorway in her robe with 2 cups of coffee. "I'll rest when it's finished," I said. "You always say that." She handed me my cup and settled onto Aaron's stool. "Is this one different?" "Warrant dine." I turned it over. "This man needs it to be. His whole operation is riding on what I put into this wood." She sat with me a while, drinking her coffee and watching me work. Then she said, "Then it had better be the finest thing you've ever made." It was. Clifford took that set to a regional design showcase in Atlanta. He reached me from a payphone the following morning. This was well before a cell phone was something everyone carried, and I could hear him fighting to keep his voice from giving way. "Walter," he said, "I just signed a contract worth more than my entire last year's revenue, because of that dining set, because of you." My chest went warm in a way that had nothing to do with pride. It was something quieter than that. The deep satisfaction of a thing done right all the way through without shortcuts. "Don't thank me," I said. "Thank the oak." He laughed again. "I'm thanking you, you stubborn old man." Clifford and I worked together for years after that. He sold, I built. We never drew up another formal contract past that first one, just a handshake and a phone call whenever he had need of something new. I never followed up on where the pieces ended up. I made them and I let them go. And now here I was, sitting in the rain on my son's front steps 30 years on. That handshake felt like the last firm thing left in the world to grip. I fished my phone from my pocket. The screen had a crack running across one corner, rain spotted, barely bright enough to make out. I scrolled until Clifford's name came up in my contacts. My thumb hung over it. "Think he still remembers us, buddy?" I asked Buck. Buck swung his head around and licked the rainwater off my wrist. I nearly pressed call. Nearly. My thumb was right there, trembling more from the cold than from any hesitation when headlights swept the front face of the house. A dark sedan eased to the curb. The engine died. For a moment, there was nothing but the rain and the hiss of wet rubber on asphalt, and the far-off sound of Charlotte traffic beyond the tree line. The driver's door swung open. My heart did something strange, not pain, not exactly hope, but that feeling that arrives just before something shifts when the air itself seems to hold still. I squinted through the downpour, not trusting my old eyes in the dark, trying to make out the figure standing by the car. Then the man stepped under the reach of the porch light, and the breath left my body entirely. Silver hair, broad shoulders still carrying themselves straight, despite 65 years of living. A dark canvas jacket beaded with rain. That face, older than I remembered, time had carved it deeper, but the eyes were unchanged. Still level, still the eyes of a man who settles what he owes. "Clifford," I said. My voice came out worn and low, scraped thin by the cold and by everything pressing behind it. He took in the picture, me hunched on those wet steps soaked through, old dog at my side, suitcase at my feet, and he didn't flinch. He didn't offer pity. He said the thing a man says when words have run out, and he knows it. "Come on, Walter, you and Buck both." Clifford Davenport had never been one for extra words. Not once in all the years I'd known him. That was among the things I'd always respected about the man. He bent down, took hold of my suitcase before I could reach for it, and walked back toward his car like it was the most natural motion in the world. Like he'd made this drive for exactly this purpose and saw no need to announce it until he was ready. "Clifford," I said, pressing myself up off the steps. My knees lit up and I swallowed the sound. "You don't have to do this, Walter." He said my name the way a man closes a door, not unkindly, just firmly. "Get in the car." Buck was already trotting toward the passenger side, like he'd been waiting on a ride all evening. Animals always know. I've said it my whole life, and I'll go to my grave saying it. I climbed in. The heater was already going. Warm air met my face and my soaked shirt, and every muscle in my body seemed to let go at once somewhere between relief and a shame I didn't want to name. I was 72 years old, sitting in another man's car dripping rainwater onto his leather seat, because my own son had carried my suitcase to the front door. "Nadine called me," Clifford said, easing away from the curb, eyes on the road. "She saw it happen from across the street. She was over visiting her niece 2 houses down." I turned to look at him. Nadine Beckett, my neighbor of 30 years, the woman who had shown up with casseroles every week after Lorene passed, who had put her name on a piece of paper for me without asking a single question. Of course Nadine had been watching. Of course she had. "She had no business calling you at this hour," I said. It came out rougher than I intended, scraped raw by everything I was still working to hold back. "She had every business," Clifford said, "and you know it." I turned to the window. Charlotte slid past in long streaks of light and rain. Gas stations, late-night diners with neon bleeding color onto the wet pavement. A city that never fully goes quiet, moving right along with itself, as though nothing had happened, as though a 72-year-old man hadn't just been shown the door of his own son's house. Buck rested his chin on my arm from the back seat. I reached back and set my hand on his head without turning around. Clifford's place in the Myers Park neighborhood was a modest 2-story, older than the houses around it, and better made than any of them. He had had the woodwork on the front porch done by a craftsman he trusted. Me, actually, 15 years back. I recognized the grain pattern on the porch columns the instant the headlights found them. The room he took me to was on the 2nd floor. Small and clean, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, and a water bowl already set on the floor for Buck. I looked at that water bowl and felt something give way behind my sternum. "You were expecting us," I said. Nadine called ahead. Clifford put my suitcase down by the dresser. "Bathroom's down the hall. Extra toothbrush in the cabinet." He turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He drew out a folded envelope and extended it toward me. "I've been looking for the right moment to give you this. Turns out the right moment is tonight." I took it. The paper was heavy goods stock, the kind used by lawyers and accountants. I unfolded it and read the heading, Deferred Compensation Summary, Walter Pruitt, Davenport, Fine Woodworks. My eyes dropped to the figure at the bottom of the page. The room tilted slightly. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my legs stopped being willing to hold me. "Clifford." My voice had gone somewhere very small. "What is this?" He settled into the chair by the window, elbows on his knees, looking at me straight the way he always had. "Every piece you designed for me across 30 years, Walter, I paid you what we'd agreed on. But the royalties from the collections that kept moving pieces that ended up in showrooms, hotels, private estates, I kept a separate accounting, because I knew you'd never ask." My throat tightened like something was closing around it. "You should have told me." "I tried twice," he said. 2012. You told me you didn't need anything beyond what we'd settled on. 2017. Same answer. He sat back. "So I held it, and I kept adding to it, because it was yours, Walter. Every cent of it was yours. I was just keeping it until you had need of it." My hands had begun to shake, and not from the cold. The paper rattled between my fingers, and I pressed it flat against my knee to quiet it. 15 years, I said. 15 years. I looked at the number, again, looked away, looked back. The kind of number that told me I was not, had never been the broken-down old man my son's house had reduced me to feeling like tonight. Why? My voice cracked on that single word, and I left it cracked. "Clifford, why would you do this?" He was quiet for a moment, not the hollow kind of quiet, the working kind. Then he said, "You know what you did for me in 1993, Walter? You didn't just build a dining set. You drove yourself half into the ground for a stranger's dream. You put everything you had into something that wasn't yours to begin with. And because of that, my company didn't go under. My family had food on the table. My kids got their education. He held my gaze with those steady eyes. You never let me repay that. So I paid it into that account instead, every year, whether you'd have wanted me to or not. Clifford's voice had softened, now the edge gone out of it entirely. You spent your whole life building things for other people. You built your son's future with your own 2 hands. Tonight, you're going to sleep in a warm room, and tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. All right? I nodded. I didn't trust my voice with actual words just then. Clifford rose and moved toward the door. Buck had already curled himself up on the rug at the foot of the bed, chin resting on his paws, watching us both. One more thing, Clifford said from the doorway. He had the look of a man who has been carrying a sentence for a long time and is finally setting it down. That money is enough to live on, Walter, for a good long while. Which means whatever comes next with Aaron, with the house, with any of it, you won't be coming at it from a place of desperation. You understand me? I raised my eyes to his. My chest ached with something that was grief and gratitude all wound together, impossible to pull apart. I understand you, I said. He nodded once, switched off the light, and left me alone with Buck and the sound of rain against the roof and a piece of paper that was rearranging everything I thought I knew about where I stood. I sat there in the dark a long while, that document resting on my knee, turning over the $47,000 I had handed my son in a plain envelope, thinking about a piece of paper Aaron had signed without reading, thinking about a house in Foxcroft that had my money buried in its foundation like a secret kept from me by my own hand. Something was stirring inside me, not anger, not yet, something older and quieter than anger. Clarity. I woke the next morning in Clifford's guest room, with Buck's chin resting on the edge of the mattress, his brown eyes fixed on me, like he'd been standing watch all night. Gray light was pressing through the curtains. Somewhere below me, coffee was coming on. And the first thought that arrived before the ache across my back, before the memory of that front door clicking shut, was a morning 6 months ago, standing on a hillside in Avery County with the deed to my land in my hand. Let me take you back there. April 2023. The dogwoods were blooming along the ridge, white flowers against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. That small piece of land had belonged to my family for 2 generations. 3 acres of hardwood forest, a creek threading along the eastern edge, and the stump of a red oak my grandfather had felled before I drew my first breath. I used to go sit on that stump and think. Some of the clearest thinking of my life happened on that stump. Nadine Beckett found me there the morning of the sale, same as she always seemed to appear when something that mattered was unfolding. Nadine had been my neighbor for 30 years, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s. Silver hair cropped close, with the kind of straight-backed carriage that said the world had tried to push her around more than once and hadn't gotten far. She came up the hill in her good walking shoes and stood next to me looking out over the tree line. "You sure about this, Walter?" she asked. I ran my thumb along the edge of the deed. The paper had gone warm from writing in my shirt pocket all morning. "Aaron needs the money, Nadine. He can't cover the down payment on his own." "I know what Aaron needs," she said in that measured tone she used when she had a disagreement, but had decided not to take it head on. "I'm asking if you're sure." I looked out toward the creek, catching the morning light through the trees. Lorene and I had walked that creek every Sunday for 22 years. After she passed, I walked it alone. Buck used to wade around in the shallows while I stood on the bank, talking to her the way you talk to someone you're not sure can still hear you. Maybe she could. I've never settled that question in my own mind. "She'd want him to have it," I said. "Lorene always said everything we built was for him." Nadine didn't answer straight off. She just stood there beside me, both of us looking at that land the way you look at a person you're saying goodbye to. Then my phone went off. "Aaron." I picked up on the second ring. "Son. Dad, hey." His voice was quick, clipped the voice he used when he was planted at his desk. "Just checking in. Everything on track for this morning." Something small and cold passed through my chest at the words "on track." Like this was a business transaction? Like I was a vendor hitting a delivery window? "I'm signing at 10, I said. "Just taking a few minutes up on the hill first." Right. I heard him tap something on his desk. "And you'll wire it directly?" "Yeah. To the account you sent me. I'll wire it today." "Perfect." A pause. "Hey, Dad. This means a lot to us. Really." "I know it does, son." After I hung up, Nadine looked at me from the side. I could feel it without turning. I kept my gaze on the creek. "He didn't ask how you were," she said. He's busy, Nadine. She let it go. That was Nadine's way. She knew when to press and when to step back and let a man make his own mistakes without interference. The closing at the notary's office took about 45 minutes. I signed where they pointed. I surrendered the deed. $45,000 moved into the account Aaron had given me. Just like that, 2 generations of land became a line item in somebody else's mortgage application. Before I left, I stopped at the small folding table near the window and asked the notary for a plain piece of paper and a pen. He handed them over without asking why. I wrote it out longhand, simple and clean, the way I'd always kept my workshop, records the date, my name, Aaron's name, the amount, $47,000, the purpose down, payment assistance for the property at Foxcroft, Charlotte, North Carolina, and at the bottom, one line I added, because my father had drilled into me that a man always writes down what he expects to be repaid upon request. I slid it across to Aaron when he came in to countersign the wire confirmation. He picked it up, glanced at it, and smiled. The way you smile at a child who hands you something they've drawn. "Dad, this isn't necessary," he said. "Humor an old man," I told him. He signed it quickly, barely past the first 2 lines, before he set the pen down. Nadine had followed me to the notary in her own car. I hadn't asked her. She just showed up the way she always did. When Aaron signed and handed the paper back, Nadine quietly took the pen and put her own name at the bottom, in the witness line I'd left blank. Aaron glanced at her. She looked back at him with those clear gray eyes and said, "Seemed like the right thing to do." He laughed it off. I folded the paper and tucked it back into my shirt pocket right against my chest. That afternoon, I drove out to the hill one final time. The land already had the feel of something belonging to someone else, not because anything visible had changed, but because my tie to it had been severed and I could feel the absence of it. I sat on my grandfather's stump for a long while. The creek moved. A woodpecker worked at something in the trees above. Buck lay beside me with his head across my knee, and I rested my hand on his back and felt his breathing slow and steady. "Well, Lorene," I said to the air and the dogwoods and whatever might be paying attention, "I hope I'm doing right." The wind shifted through the oak leaves overhead, and I took that for an answer because it was the only one available. I drove away without looking back. I told myself it was because looking back made leaving harder. Truth is, I was afraid that if I did look, I'd swing the truck around, and Aaron needed that money. My son needed that money. That was the only thought I permitted myself for the entire 4-hour drive north to Charlotte. Charlotte in May is beautiful in a way that makes you trust it too easily. The trees lining the boulevard were thick and green. The Foxcroft neighborhoods carried that quiet, well-heeled stillness. And Aaron's house? Our house, I told myself back then, had a front porch with 2 rocking chairs and a yard crying out for attention. I got to work on that yard the first week. I fixed a loose board on the porch steps. I rehung the side fence gate that had been dragging the concrete every time it opened. I put in green beans along the south-facing fence, same as I'd done every summer since I was 30. No reason to change that now. Aaron came out one morning with coffee and looked over the garden bed I'd turned by hand. "Dad, you didn't have to do all this," he said, and he meant it warmly, the way people mean things when everything between them is still going well. "Felt good to use my hands," I told him. "I'd go sideways without a project to work on." He laughed, clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, there's plenty around here if you're looking." Those early weeks had a rhythm I could settle into. I was up before anyone else got the first pot of coffee going, took Buck around the neighborhood, while the streets were still quiet. Celeste was home on maternity leave. Owen had just turned 3 months old, and she was fixed on him the way a new mother has every right to be. We weren't close, but we kept things civil. She thanked me when I put dinner on the table. I cleared out of her way when the baby was down. Buck was careful moving through the house. He always had been a good dog, never jumped on the furniture, never wheedled at the table, or raised his voice without cause. Buck was a well-mannered animal by any measure, but Celeste observed him the way a person studies something they've already written off, not fearful, just vigilant, cataloging his behavior until she found something worth citing. By June, she had what she needed. "Walter, I've been doing some reading about pet dander around newborns," she said one evening, catching me at the sink. Her tone carried the particular smoothness of a speech practiced in private. "Everything I've found says it can be a serious concern for babies in their first 6 months. I'd be more comfortable with Buck keeping to your room." "He hasn't gone anywhere near the baby," I said, holding my voice steady. "I understand that, but for Owen's sake, you know." She offered a smile that stopped well short of her eyes. "You see what I'm saying?" I did see. I just kept what I saw to myself. After that week, Buck's world shrank to my bedroom and the narrow strip of yard off the back of the house. He bore it without complaint. Dogs carry their burdens without a word, which has always struck me as a kind of dignity. But each morning, he'd be posted outside my door, waiting with a stillness that cost me something to witness, as if he needed to confirm I hadn't left him behind. "I haven't left you behind," I'd tell him every single morning, and I meant it. The summer stretched on. Aaron's hours grew longer, his arrivals home later. When he did walk through the door, his attention was somewhere miles away, thumb working the phone at the dinner table, body present, but mind off running numbers on something he couldn't quite get to add up. One Saturday in July, I tried drawing him into a conversation about a red oak I'd come across in the park 2 blocks up, a grand old specimen, its canopy spread wide enough to shade half an acre. Told him it put me in mind of the old tree line out on the Avery County land. He glanced up briefly. "That's great, Dad," he said. His eyes went straight back to the screen. Something clenched in my chest. I lifted my fork and finished my supper. Then August brought Celeste's college friend Faye for a long weekend. From my room, I could hear Celeste walking her through the house, the kitchen they had redone the nursery. Celeste had outfitted herself the reading nook she'd carved into the landing upstairs. Every room presented in her voice, her vision, her handiwork. Then Faye asked the question, "And who all is staying here with you?" "My father-in-law," Celeste replied. Something subtle shifted in how she said it, a fraction of a degree, but enough. "He's here temporarily." I was on the landing above them. That single word landed the way a splinter does almost nothing at first, then working inward deeper than something so small has any right to reach. Temporarily. I turned and walked back to my room and lowered myself onto the bed. Buck climbed up beside me and rested his chin in my lap, those soft brown eyes tipped up at me. "It's all right," I told him. "She just means till things find their footing." Buck rumbled something in his throat, not a whine, exactly more, the sound of a creature who isn't quite buying it. "Stop looking at me that way," I said. But, come evening, I crossed the room to my old valise, the battered blue case I'd hauled up from Avery County, and reached inside for something specific. My fingers closed on a folded page near the bottom, settled into the lining, where I tucked things that mattered. I drew it out and smoothed it open across the bedspread. Aaron's signature, Nadine's signature, the date the figure owed upon request. I'd placed it there the morning I first came to Charlotte, the same unhurried, unannounced way I'd always managed things that needed managing no audience required. I refolded it with care and set it back. That was when Celeste's voice reached me from the kitchen below, low, deliberate, not intended for my ears. Aaron was home by then, and while the words came through broken, I caught the shape of them. "This was supposed to be temporary, Aaron." Aaron's answer came softer, retreating the way a riverbank surrenders to the current. "I know, Nessa, I know. Just a little more time." I sat there with Buck warm against my ribs, studying the ceiling, turning over a single question. When had my son ever used the word temporary to describe any corner of his own life? He hadn't. Not a single time. Only mine. September in Charlotte arrives uncertain of itself. Some mornings the air still hangs thick and close, summer refusing to concede the ground. Then you'll step outside another morning and catch that first cold thread of autumn, running through it clean and unsparing, the way only cold weather tells the truth. I'd been awake since 5. Always have been. 30 years of early workshop mornings burned that hour into me. Light best before 7, and wood doesn't wait on a man who sleeps late. I'd brewed a pot, filled the green mug Aaron had brought me from a work trip, and taken my place at the kitchen counter to watch Charlotte stir itself awake through the window over the sink. Buck had settled under the table, chin flat on his paws, keeping tabs on me with his eyes the way he does whenever he's appointed himself my keeper. Aaron's phone lay on the counter next to the toaster. He'd come down 20 minutes earlier, still half put together, poured himself some water, and gone back upstairs to finish dressing. The phone stayed behind face down the way he always left it. Then it lit. I wasn't reaching for it. That needs to be said plainly. The screen blazed up right alongside my coffee cup, and the message preview was there before I could turn my head. A text from Celeste addressed to what appeared to be a thread, and that opening line floated up at me like something surfacing from deep water. "Once Dad sells the land, we'll finally have the down payment." My hand-stopped mug lifted halfway. I set it down on the counter without a sound. I picked up the phone, told myself I was only confirming the thread name, only making certain my eyes hadn't tricked me. And then I quit lying to myself and scrolled to the top. The thread had started in February, 8 months back, 2 months before Aaron had telephoned me in Foxcroft, voice warm full of talk about family and seeing to me in my later years. The exchange between Aaron and Celeste had the tidy logic of a business document, stripped down, purposeful eyes fixed on the outcome. Aaron wants, Dad sells the land, we'll finally have the down payment. Celeste, how long is a while, Aaron? Until we get the money sorted, then we figure it out. Celeste, how long is that going to take, Aaron? Not long, he'll do it if I ask right. I read through it 4 times. 4, each pass. I was hunting for something I'd gotten wrong, a misread word, a tone that shifted in better light, some piece of context that softened the whole thing into something else. The 4th reading gave me exactly what the first one had, like a man pressing his hand to a wall he trusted and feeling it move. He'll do it if I ask right. My hands gripped the counter's edge, knuckles tightening, not against cold, not against the weight of years, but against something I'd been lugging in silence for months, something that had no clean word attached to it. Not anger exactly, not grief exactly, but whatever occupies the territory between those two, burning and hollow in the same breath. I set the phone back precisely where I'd found it, same position, same angle. Then I stood at that window and looked out over the yard, the green bean plants I'd put in along the south-facing fence back in May, heavy on the vine, now in the September heat. The gate I'd rehung, the narrow lawn I'd trimmed to a clean edge with a tool I'd borrowed from next door. And I thought about what a man gives to a place that was never built to keep him. I heard Aaron's foot on the bottom stair. I opened the faucet and ran my mug under the water, my back turned to the room, keeping my face arranged the way you have to. Sometimes the way you train it to hold still when everything underneath it is anything but. Aaron came in. I heard the phone lifted from the counter, a brief pause, then the soft sound of it sliding into his pocket. "Morning, Dad," he said. "Easy, the same as any morning." I shut off the water and turned around. I looked at my son, the way you look when you're actually looking the way I had on that rain-soaked night, searching his face for the man I'd raised. I found him there. That was the part that undid me. He was standing right in front of me. My Aaron, the kid in the little tractor pajamas who used to perch on a stool in my workshop, asking why wood had a smell. He was right there inside that 44-year-old face, and he had no idea what I had just read, and he was looking at me like the world was exactly as it appeared. "Morning, son," I said. "Coffee's ready." He poured himself a cup, brushed his lips across the top of Owen's head as Celeste came down the stairs with the baby and was out the front door by 7:15. Same as every other morning. I stood in that kitchen a long time after the door closed behind him, long enough for my coffee to go cold, long enough for Buck to pull himself out from under the table and lean his weight against my leg, which is what he does when something is wrong before I've found the words for it myself. "I know," I told him. The words came out scraped and hollow, like something dragged across gravel. I didn't weep. I'd like to say I held myself together out of some reserve of strength. But that's not the honest account. The truth is something inside me had gone very quiet the way a workshop goes quiet in those early minutes. Before you lift the first tool, when the wood is still whole and uncut, and you're standing there deciding what it's going to become. I climbed the stairs to my room, sat on the edge of the bed. Buck came up beside me. He only did that when he sensed it was needed and laid his big gray muzzled head across my knee. I sat with my palm resting on his back, drawing something from the slow, steady, honest rhythm of his breathing. And for the first time since I'd come to Charlotte, I let myself ask the question I'd been mortaring up behind walls for months. Had my son ever truly wanted me here? Or was I simply the down payment? The answer settled in my chest like a splinter driven too deep for fingers to reach. I could feel where it sat. I just hadn't found a way to it yet. But I had started looking. 40 years of working wood teaches you to read what hasn't happened yet. A hairline in the grain that seems trivial today will open into a full split within 6 months if you leave it alone. A joint that holds snug in August will work itself loose when the winter air pulls the moisture out. You develop an eye for the direction things are traveling before they arrive. After that September morning at the kitchen counter, I began reading Celeste the way I read Timber. What I saw made my stomach turn over. It started with small things, the variety you wave away once, twice, 3 times before you accept that they are not small at all. Celeste had a habit of stepping out to the back deck to take certain calls. I'd registered it before without thinking anything of it, but now I began tracking when those calls came. They arrived in clusters. 2 or 3 over the course of a week, then a gap, then another run. Always the same voice kept low, back squared toward the house, one hand moving through the air, the way hers did when she was making a case to someone who wasn't conceding. One afternoon toward the end of September, I was seated at the kitchen table with a book when Celeste came in from the yard phone still in hand and flipped her laptop open on the counter to check something in a hurry. Owen had started up crying from upstairs, and she went to him without closing the screen. I wasn't trying to read it, but the subject line was 3 feet from my chair in type, large enough that a man with reading glasses had no need to lean forward. Property listing inquiry, Foxcroft. The color drained out of my face. Celeste was back downstairs in under 2 minutes, Owen on her hip. She glanced at me at the table, and for a fraction of a second, the kind of fraction you can only catch if you're already watching for it. Her eyes moved to the laptop, then back to me. Then she walked to the counter and eased it shut, smooth and unhurried, as though she were simply tidying. "How's he doing?" I asked. "Fine," she said, her voice perfectly level. "Just wanted his pacifier." She carried the baby into the living room. I sat there at that table, eyes on the wall, and felt the entire last 6 months rearrange into a shape I could finally read. 2 days after that, Glenda Tatum came to visit. I had been in Celeste's mother's company exactly 3 times before that morning. She was a compact woman in her mid-60s, hair colored a shade of auburn that owed nothing to her natural years jewelry that announced itself a half step before she walked into a room. She carried herself with the settled authority of a woman who had spent several decades concluding she was the most significant person in any given space. She and Celeste shared the same way of taking in a room, quick calculating, already measuring what might be changed. She arrived on a Saturday morning while Aaron was at the office. I was out back with Buck when I heard her come through the front. Through the screen door, I caught their voices moving together through the house, Glenda's carrying the way it always did. "This kitchen feels bigger than I remembered," Glenda said. "We had the island extended last year," Celeste told her. "Smart move, that adds value." A pause, then footsteps drifting toward the living room. "And these ceilings, what are those 9 feet? 9.5. That sound Glenda made like an appraiser marking a box. "The market's strong right now in this part of town, honey. It really is. You don't want to sit on something like this longer than you need to." I stood perfectly still in the yard. Buck pressed against my knee as I listened to Celeste's mother move through my son's house, the house my money had helped put them in, and speak of it the way you speak of an asset waiting to be converted. "I know," Celeste said. Her voice was quieter than her mother's, but there was no hesitation in it. "I just need a little more time to get a few things sorted." "What things?" A paused just long enough to carry weight. "The situation upstairs." My jaw set so hard my back teeth ached. I was the situation upstairs. I walked Buck to the far end of the yard and kept myself there near the fence until I heard Glenda's car leave about an hour later. When I came back inside, Celeste was at the kitchen counter feeding Owen. She turned and gave me a smile so polished it could have been buffed from glass. "Walter, I hope we didn't bother you. Mom just dropped by for a bit." "Not at all," I said. "Good to see her." I went upstairs. My legs felt as though someone had replaced everything inside them with pipe. I sat on the bed and pressed the heels of my hands hard against my eyes, using the pressure to give myself something to feel besides the heat building behind my ribs. She was going to sell the house. I didn't have the kind of proof you could lay before a lawyer, not yet. But I had 4 decades of reading grain and stress lines and concealed fractures, and I knew exactly what I'd just witnessed. The house my money had helped purchase was being positioned for a sale, and I was the last piece that needed to be cleared away before the transaction could move forward. I went to the valise. My hands found the paper before my eyes did. I drew it out and unfolded it across my knee. His name at the bottom, Nadine's below it, as witness the date in April, $47,000. And that single line I'd added at the end, the line he had signed without reading to be repaid upon request. I folded it back up. This time I put it in my shirt pocket. Not the valise, my shirt pocket close. I looked across the room at Buck. His tail moved once slowly. "We're gonna need that paper, buddy," I said, keeping my voice low. He set his head down on his paws and held me with those soft brown eyes that had never given me anything but the truth in 11 years. Outside, a car moved past on the quiet Foxcroft street. A single leaf broke from the tree by the window and turned its slow way down. Autumn was settling in for real, and something in me, something old and patient and not yet finished, was quietly getting ready. The first thing I registered when I opened my eyes was the silence, but not the kind Aaron's house carried, that coiled breath held quiet where you never knew what temperament was waiting at the foot of the stairs. Clifford's house had the silence of a place with nothing left to prove to anybody. Morning light pushed soft and gray through the curtains. Down the hall somewhere, a clock kept its steady count. Buck was curled at the foot of the bed, and when I stirred, he raised his head and fixed me with those calm brown eyes, his tail making one slow drag across the quilt. "We made it through the night," I told him. He set his chin back down, content with that. I lay there a few minutes, just pulling air in and letting it go. My back ached the way it always does. After a cold night, that deep grinding familiarity I'd long accepted as the toll of 72 years. Through the window, I could hear Charlotte rousing itself a delivery truck, rumbling somewhere down the block, the low hum of traffic out on the boulevard, a dog sounding off from 2 houses over. I was reaching for my phone on the nightstand when it rang right there in my hand. Nadine Beckett. I hit the green button before the second ring had finished. "Nadine!" Her voice came back sharp and warm all at once, the voice of a woman who'd been awake for hours and had been arriving at a decision during all of them. "Walter, how are you? Where are you?" "Clifford's place," I said. "I'm all right." A breath of relief I could hear plainly across the line. "Good, good. I've been up since 4 worrying about you, you stubborn old man." Something small and tight in my chest eased at that, despite everything. "You didn't need to lose sleep on my account." "Well, I did so. That ship has sailed." A brief pause. "Walter, I need to tell you what happened last night. All of it, from the beginning." I worked myself up against the headboard and listened. Nadine had been visiting her niece, a young woman named Dana, who lived 2 houses down the block from Aaron in that same Foxcroft neighborhood. A fact she hadn't thought to mention when I moved in, because it hadn't seemed relevant until the night before. She'd been standing at Dina's front window when the light shifted on Aaron's porch. She had watched Aaron pull open the front door. She had watched him set my suitcase down on the front walk. "I saw everything, Walter," she said, and her voice dropped half a register, the way it does when someone is working to keep themselves steady. "I saw you pick up that suitcase. I saw you walk out into that rain with Buck. I saw that door close behind you." My throat tightened. I turned toward the window and went still, the way a man goes still when the wrong move might crack something he can't afford to crack just then. "I had my phone out before that door finished closing," Nadine said, and her voice turned fierce and level, the voice of a woman who has made up her mind and would like the world to try objecting. "I recorded it, Walter, from Dina's front porch. You, the suitcase, Buck, the whole thing. Clear as day, even in the rain." I drew a slow breath. "You recorded it. Every second of it. And then I called Clifford because I knew you'd sit on those front steps all night before you'd ask a soul for help, and I was not about to let that happen." I rubbed my jaw with my free hand, the stubble rasping against my palm. Outside, the delivery truck had rolled further on down the street. Buck had repositioned himself at the foot of the bed and was watching me with his ears tipped forward, reading the call from my end the way he always did. "I don't know what to say to you," I told Nadine. "You don't have to say anything. Just listen." Another pause, and then her voice shifted softer, more deliberate, the way she used to speak to me in those weeks, right after Lorene passed when she'd arrived with food and never once pushed me to talk about it. "Walter, what do you want? Not what you think the right thing is. Not what makes things simpler for Aaron. What do you actually want?" Nobody had posed that question to me in a very long time. It settled in my chest and spread slowly like a knot of green wood, finally surrendering its tension. "I want what's fair," I said. The words came out quiet, but with a certainty that told me I'd been thinking them without realizing it. "Not revenge, Nadine. I'm not interested in burning anything down. I just want what's fair. I put $47,000 of my life's work into that house. Aaron needs to understand you can't do what he did and simply walk away from it without any consequence." Nadine was quiet for a moment, the thinking kind, not the empty kind. Then you need a lawyer, Walter, and I think I know exactly who. I don't know the first thing about lawyers. You don't need to. You just need to walk through the door and tell the truth." A small sound that was almost a laugh. "You've been doing that your whole life. Shouldn't be too hard." Her name is Adriana Voss. She has an office downtown that looks out over the Catawba River. She handled my cousin's property dispute 3 years ago, and she fought like a woman with something personal riding on the outcome. Sharp as they come, and she does not suffer fools. A brief pause. I already called her this morning, Walter. She can see you Thursday. Something ached in my chest that I couldn't name. Cleanly gratitude and grief wound together so tight I couldn't separate one thread from the other. This woman had lost sleep over me, had stood at a window in the rain with her phone out, had called Clifford and a lawyer before I'd even thought to reach out to anyone. Nadine, I said, why do you always... Because Lorene would have done the same for me, she said, simple, final. The kind of answer that closes a door gently so no one has to feel the click. I swallowed hard. My eyes burned in a way I hadn't permitted in years, a deep heat pressing up behind the bridge of my nose that I forced back with everything I had. All right, I managed. Thursday. Clifford knows where the office is. Her voice went gentle. And Walter eats something this morning. You sound like a man running on coffee and pure stubbornness. That'd be accurate, I said. She laughed a real one short and clear, and it was the finest sound I'd heard since I walked out into that rain. After I hung up, I sat with the phone resting in my lap and Buck watching me from across the quilt. I looked down at that old gray-muzzled face that had never once failed me, and I felt something settle into my bones like timber, finding its level after a long haul. We've got a name, buddy, I said. Adriana Voss. Buck's tail swept the quilt, once slow and deliberate, like an old judge bringing down a gavel. Clifford's car smelled of leather and old coffee, and a faint trace of sawdust that I figured came from the blanket folded on the back seat, the one he used to wrap finished pieces when he carried them to clients. Some things about a man hold steady no matter how far he's come. With Clifford, it had always been the sawdust. He drove me downtown on a Thursday morning in late October. The trees along Providence Road had gone full amber, and rust leaves releasing in the dry breeze and skittering across the windshield like they had somewhere they needed to be. Charlotte in autumn carries a particular quality of light gold and faintly melancholy, like something beautiful that understands it won't last. I had my old blue suitcase in the back seat with Buck, not because I needed everything inside it, but because the paper was in there, and I wasn't letting that paper leave my sight. Clifford pulled into the parking garage beneath a glass office building that looked out over the Catawba River. He switched off the engine and turned to me. You ready for this? I gave it an honest moment. No, I said, but I'm going in anyway. He nodded like that was the correct answer. I'll be down in the lobby. Take all the time you need. Adriana Voss's office was on the 14th floor. The elevator opened into a small waiting room with well-chosen furniture and a window that framed the Catawba like a painting, the river gray-green in the morning light, a barge pushing slow and heavy downstream. A young assistant brought me straight in without making me wait, which I appreciated. I had spent enough of my years waiting. Adriana Voss was not what I had expected. Before we get to what I found and what it meant for everything, I thought I understood about the people closest to me. Let me ask you this. If someone you loved had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you hold your ground and let the truth do the work on its own time? I think I had pictured someone older, a grandmother type, silver-haired and reassuring. Adriana was in her late 40s, dark hair, drawn back clean reading glasses pushed up onto her head, as though she'd set them there and forgotten them. She wore a charcoal blazer, and the kind of concentrated expression that made you feel the moment you walked in like you were the only matter in the room worth her attention. She rose when I entered and reached across the desk to shake my hand, a real handshake firm and brief, the sort that carries meaning. Mr. Pruitt, she said, sit down, tell me everything, and don't leave anything out because you think it reflects poorly on you. I sat. I set the suitcase in the chair beside me. I laid out the whole of it, the phone call in April, the invitation to come to Charlotte selling the land, the note I'd written by hand at the notary's office, the text message I'd read off Aaron's phone screen, the email subject line on Celeste's laptop, Glenda walking through that house like she was calculating its market value. I talked for close to 40 minutes, and Adriana did not interrupt me once. She sat forward with her elbows on the desk, eyes fixed on my face, and she listened the way very few people are capable of listening, as though each word were a piece of evidence she was cataloging as it arrived. When I finished, I reached into the suitcase and placed the paper on her desk. She picked it up, read it once, then read it again. Her expression didn't shift dramatically, but something behind her eyes sharpened the look of a person who has just located the exact tools she was searching for. "Nadine Beckett's signature as witness," she said. "She was present when Aaron signed it. She offered to be there. That is very good, Mr. Pruitt. That is very good." She set the paper down with the care you give something that can break. "What was the total amount?" $47,000. She made a note, then turned to her computer and typed something with deliberate focus. Her eyes traveled across the screen. Then she looked up at me over her reading glasses, which had worked their way back down to the bridge of her nose. "Can I call you Walter?" "Please." "Walter, I pulled the deed and mortgage records for the Foxcroft property this morning," once Nadine reached me. She folded her hands on the desk. "Your name appears on the original co-signer agreement filed at the time of the loan application. But approximately 4 months after closing, that agreement was amended. Your name was removed." My chest pulled tight. "Can they do that? Not without your written consent, which I'm going to assume they did not have." "I never signed anything of the sort." "Then Aaron or someone acting on his behalf had you removed from that agreement without your knowledge." She let that sit for a moment before going on. "Now, I want to be clear with you about what this means practically. It doesn't grant you ownership of the property the house is titled in Aaron and Celeste's names, but it does give us an additional breach of contract argument that strengthens your civil case considerably." I leaned forward. "What exactly is our civil case?" Adriana picked up a pen and tapped it once against her notepad. "We file suit in Mecklenburg County Superior Court. We present the promissory note, the paper you wrote by hand. And yes, it qualifies as a legally binding promissory note under North Carolina law. We argue that Aaron borrowed $47,000 from you with an explicit agreement to repay it upon request. We seek repayment plus statutory interest plus legal fees." She paused. "There is one more matter I need to raise with you, and I need an honest answer before we proceed." "Go ahead." She set the pen down. "When Aaron applied for the mortgage, he was required to disclose the source of his down payment funds on the loan application. If he listed your $47,000 as a family gift, rather than a loan, which the promissory note proves it was, then he filed a false statement on a federally backed mortgage application." She held my gaze. "That is mortgage fraud, Walter. It's a federal offense." The words settled into the room and stayed there. I looked down at the surface of her desk, dark walnut, well made with a fine straight grain. I noticed things like that without trying to. "What does that mean for Aaron?" My voice came out careful and quiet. "It means that if I report it to the lender or to federal authorities, it triggers a separate investigation entirely, criminal exposure, potential prosecution." She kept her eyes on mine. "I want to ask you something, and I need your gut answer, not the one you think you ought to give. Do you want to hurt your son, or do you want justice?" I didn't need to think it over. The answer had been sitting in my chest since the morning I read those text messages at the kitchen counter. "Justice," I said. "I don't want him in prison. I don't want to destroy him. I want him to understand what he did to me, to himself, to everything I spent my life building so he could have something decent." My jaw was tight, but my voice held steady. "Can you get there without the federal piece?" Adriana uncapped a fresh legal pad with a small, precise click. "Yes," she said. "We use the mortgage fraud as leverage only. If Aaron cooperates and satisfies the judgment, it goes no further. If he fights us or creates obstruction, we revisit that option." She looked up. "All right, Walter, let's begin." I settled back in that chair and felt something release across my shoulders that had been knotted up since September. Outside the window behind her, the Catawba moved on beneath the gray October sky, carrying everything downstream, the way rivers always have, patient and indifferent and impossible to stop. I was 72 years old, and I had never once hired a lawyer, but 4 decades of working wood had taught me that the right tool applied with care can bring out what a piece of timber was always meant to be. Adriana Voss was the right tool, and I was not finished yet. 2 weeks passed between my first meeting with Adriana and the call that brought me back to her office. 2 weeks of mornings in Clifford's guest room, of long walks with Buck along the Little Sugar Creek Greenway, while Charlotte's last autumn leaves came down in slow spirals. 2 weeks of evenings in Clifford's small workshop, out back where he'd let me use the bench and the tools, running my hands over wood, the way other men run their hands over old photographs, searching for something familiar to hold on to. Adriana's call came on a Wednesday afternoon, and she used the same 4 words from the first time, only rearranged. "Walter, I need you to come in." Clifford drove me. Same parking garage, same elevator. But when I walked into Adriana's office this time, the desk was covered folders, printed emails, photographs of documents, all of it spread out in a way that told me she had been working and working hard. She looked up as I came in, and something in her expression was different. Not quite excited, but focused the way a surgeon looks just before the first incision. She gestured to the chair. "Sit down," she said. "We have more than I expected." I sat. My hands went flat on my thighs. "How much more?" "Enough?" She lifted the first folder. "I'll go in order. Stop me if something doesn't track." She opened to a printed document, a real estate listing agreement bearing Celeste's signature at the bottom. I could make it out clearly from where I sat. Her name, that looping cursive, unmistakable. "This is a listing agreement signed by Celeste Pruitt," Adriana said. "It was submitted to a licensed real estate agency operating in the Foxcroft area in August of this year, 2 months before you were asked to leave the property." She looked at me steadily. "Aaron's signature is not on this document." I leaned forward slightly. "She can do that sign without him." "No, she cannot. The property is titled in both names under North Carolina's tenancy by the entirety statute. Any contract to sell or list the property requires both signatures. This document is not legally enforceable." Adriana set it down. "But that isn't why it matters to us. It matters because it establishes intent. Celeste Pruitt was actively working to list the property 2 months before the confrontation with you, which means your removal from that house was not an impulsive reaction to some minor irritation. It was a step in a plan." The air in the room felt heavier. I held my jaw still by habit. "What else?" Adriana opened the second folder. Inside was a printed email chain, several pages, the kind of correspondence that accumulates over weeks. "This is the communication between Celeste and the listing agent. I obtained it through a formal discovery request." She turned the top page so I could see the relevant section, her finger underlining one line. I read it. My vision went soft at the edges for a moment, and I blinked it clear. That sentence just sat there on the page. "We're very close to being ready. Just need the old man's situation resolved first." I repeated it back to Adriana, 2 words at a time, like I was testing whether they'd hold their shape out loud. "The old man's situation." My voice had gone completely flat. That is how she referred to me, to a real estate agent. Adriana's professional composure held, but something behind her eyes burned steady and controlled a woman who had seen this kind of thing before and had not made her peace with it. She told me there was more. The agent had written back asking for a timeline. Celeste's reply put the window at 4 to 6 weeks, the very same span that had ended with my suitcase on a wet front walk in the rain. "How did Celeste get to this particular agent?" I asked. I kept generating questions because as long as I was asking questions, I wasn't putting my hand through that walnut desk. Adriana went to the 3rd page of the chain. The referral had come by email. Glenda Tatum had forwarded the agent's information to her daughter with a short note. "This is the one I mentioned. He's discreet." Adriana looked up. In context, she said, discreet appeared to mean the agent was willing to move forward without a complete set of signatures, a matter that could threaten his license, though not the thing she needed me focused on right now. I pressed the pads of my thumb and forefinger hard into my eye sockets until the pressure became a bloom of white at the edges of my vision. Glenda. Glenda, who had paced through every room of that house with her measuring eyes, who had leaned over to her daughter in that kitchen and said the market was strong and not to let it sit. "Walter," Adriana's voice eased down a register, steadier, more careful. "Before we go any further, I need to ask you a direct question. What is your read on Aaron?" I let my hands drop. "What do you mean?" "The listing agreement bears only Celeste's name. Aaron never put his signature to it. In my experience, that breaks one of 2 ways. Either he had no knowledge of it, or he made a deliberate choice to keep himself at arm's length." She laced her fingers together on the desk. "Which way do you lean?" That landed somewhere deep inside me. I turned it over. I heard my son's voice again in that kitchen, soft and retreating. "I know Nessa, I know, and the text thread from February clinical as a spreadsheet. He'll do it if I ask, right?" And I thought about the way Aaron had looked at me on that rainy night. Eyes dropped to the floor, because meeting mine would have meant owning what he'd allowed to happen. My read, I said slowly enough that I got the words right the first time, is that Aaron knew the outline and made a point of not filling in the details. My throat had gone rough. He didn't architect this, that was Celeste, down to the agent and the timeline. But he held the door open for it. He knew something was in motion, and he let it move. I looked across the desk. Does that distinction carry any weight in the civil case? Not a great deal. The suit names both of them as a unit, but it carries weight somewhere else. Adriana held my gaze steadily. If there is ever going to be anything remaining between you and your son when this is finished, Aaron will need to sit with a very clear accounting of what he decided not to see. I pushed out of the chair and went to the window. The Catawba was below, doing what rivers do, brown-green and unhurried, taking everything that fell into it and carrying it somewhere downstream without a word of complaint. My own reflection floated faint in the glass. Gray flannel shirt. An old man in a lawyer's office 14 floors above the water. I thought, how in God's name did this become my life? She was going to sell the house, I said, speaking toward the glass. The house my savings built, my money sitting in the foundation, and Aaron stood aside while she lined up a buyer. Behind me, I heard Adriana set her pen to the pad. Walter? Something in her tone brought me back around. There's one more matter, and it touches Aaron's loan application directly. I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. I stepped away from the window. My chest felt packed with something heavy, and my eyes were burning, and I was 72 years old, and I had apparently not yet reached the bottom of how much a man could be surprised by his own pain. Go ahead, I said. Adriana filled 2 cups before she settled back into her chair and slid one across to me without ceremony. I closed both hands around the warmth of it, not because the room was cold, because I needed something solid and real to press against. She began with the mechanics when Aaron applied for the mortgage on the Foxcroft property. He'd been required to complete a uniform residential loan application, a standard federal form that governs every home loan in the country. One section of that form asks the borrower to account for the source of the down payment funds. I kept my eyes on her face. My hands didn't move from the cup. Aaron declared your $47,000 as a family gift, she said. Not a loan, a gift. I put the cup down on the desk very carefully. But I have the paper. Exactly. A signed promissory note in your own hand, establishing clearly that the funds were a loan to be returned on demand, which means Aaron submitted a knowingly false statement on a federally backed mortgage application. She gave it one breath of silence before she continued. Then that is mortgage fraud, Walter. Under 18 U.S.C. Section 1014 federal statute, a false declaration on an application to a federally insured institution is a criminal matter. Fines. Potential imprisonment. The room felt sealed. I became aware of the building's ventilation ticking away somewhere above the ceiling. Through the window, a cloud dragged itself across the sun, and the light went gray and flat before it came back. Why go that route? I asked. My voice stayed level, but the effort was in my jaw, which ached from the holding. Adriana explained it in the same tone a doctor uses for a diagnosis, not unkind, just factual. If Aaron had disclosed the money as a loan, it would have registered as existing debt, dragging down his debt-to-income ratio and likely knocking him below the threshold for the loan size he wanted. Calling it a gift cleared the books. The bank's math worked. The approval came through. He got the house. A pause. My money had made all of it possible, and he had misrepresented it to a federal institution so that no claim could ever be traced back to it. I stood up again. My legs made that decision without consulting me. I went back to the window that had absorbed a great deal of my looking that morning, and fixed my eyes on the Catawba below. Water that simply kept moving, patient, indifferent to the foolish and the faithless alike, carrying everything on downstream. Walter. Adriana's voice reached me from across the room, measured and clear. I need your answer before the next step is taken. Referring this to the lender or to the FBI's mortgage fraud unit opens a federal investigation criminal exposure for Aaron running parallel to and separate from anything we file in civil court. A pause opened up. That decision belongs to you. I turned back to face her. The burning in my chest had the quality of something swallowed too hot. It wasn't rage at Adriana, not at the law, not even quite at Aaron. It was fury at the image that kept forming behind my eyes. A grown man 44 years old, at a desk with a federal form in front of him, choosing the word gift over the word loan, because no one would cross-check it, and the old man up in Foxcroft would never be any the wiser. No federal case, I said, hard words final as a mallet on a dowel. I will not have my son walked into a federal courtroom. I won't have him in handcuffs. My voice gave slightly on that last word, just a hairline crack enough to remind me that underneath all of this, I was still a father. But I want it on the table between us. I want Aaron to know that I know. And I want Adriana Voss to make sure that if he digs in and forces a fight, that option comes back to the table. One nod from Adriana, precise, unhesitating. Understood, leverage only. It goes no further unless he makes it necessary. She reached for a clean legal pad and walked me through the plan in the kind of ordered sequence I've always needed, the way a good set of drawings lays out a build step by step, from footing to ridge. A formal demand letter would go to Aaron's home address and to his attorney of record if he'd retained one. The letter would name the full amount owed, $47,000 plus statutory interest accumulated from the date of transfer, and require repayment within 30 days. It would cite the promissory note, Nadine Beckett's signature as witness, and the removal of my name from the co-signer agreement without my consent. The mortgage fraud would not be named outright, but the letter would note that additional matters had come to counsel's attention and that the right to raise them in court was expressly reserved. Any person who had spent time around legal correspondence would read that sentence and know precisely what it was carrying. 30 days, I said, and if he doesn't settle, we file in Mecklenburg County Superior Court. Discovery opens the bank of records, the listing agreement, the full email chain, all of it enters the record. Adriana regarded me over the rim of her glasses. Aaron is a financial analyst, Walter. He has seen Discovery from the inside. He understands what happens to a man's career when documents like those begin to surface. The pen slid across the desk toward me, and I took it. 2 pages the authorization form, clean, precise, the sort of document a man could actually follow. Here is what you're consenting to. Here are the limits of it. Here is what your signature means. Every line got read. I wasn't about to put my name on something I hadn't studied, not after watching what happened when my son skipped that step. I signed. The hand was steady as ever. 72 years old, and it still had a grip on a pen. Clifford was in the lobby when I stepped off the elevator. He'd been on his phone, but he looked up and got to his feet before I'd crossed half the distance. One red on my face told him everything. How'd it go? She's sending the letter, I told him. He gave a slow nod. We went to the car without much else said. The air outside had turned sharp, that deep November cold sliding down from the hills, the kind that carries wood smoke on it, that says winter is no longer on its way, but here. It brought Avery County to mind. That evening, Clifford unlocked the workshop and waved me in. I pulled a piece of white oak from the rack, heavy stock, straight grain, still faintly fragrant from the sawmill. Bench hand plane, and I was moving. The first pass peeled a thin ribbon of wood that curled and fell. Second pass, third. The old muscle memory came back in my shoulders before my thoughts had caught up with anything. The pressure, the angle reading the grain, with every push. After a while, the workshop was full of that, smell oak and dust, and the cold seeping in under the door, and the kind of stillness that only comes when a man does one honest thing, right stroke after stroke, until whatever is churning in his head runs out of room and goes quiet. Buck stretched out beside the bench muzzle on his paws, his breathing long and easy. Out there somewhere in the dark of Charlotte, a letter with my name on it was being written up for delivery to my son's door. And in that small shop on a cold November night, an old man drew his palm down a piece of straight oak and felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could say, that the work in front of him was true, and that being here was exactly right. The demand letter left Adriana's office on a Tuesday certified mail addressed to the Foxcroft house. Adriana had gone ahead and filed the civil complaint with Mecklenburg County Superior Court that same day because Aaron had let her preliminary notice from the week before sit without a word back, and Adriana Voss was not built for waiting past her own deadlines. Thursday at the latest was my estimate for when it would land. Nadine rang me Friday morning. I was standing at Clifford's kitchen window, nursing my second cup of coffee, watching 2 cardinals take turns at the backyard feeder. Buck was planted next to me, his eyes tracking the birds the way an old dog's will, attentive, unhurried, long past the age of caring about the chase. Walter. Nadine's voice carried a particular kind of strain, the sound of a person who'd just seen something and hadn't finished making sense of it. It arrived yesterday. I saw the mail truck. I set down my cup. Tell me. I'd been over at Dina's again. She'd talked me into another week, and truth be told, I hadn't planned to leave Charlotte until I had a better picture of how things were falling. A beat of quiet. Certified mail pulled up around 2:00 in the afternoon. Aaron was home for the day. His car was sitting right there in the drive. He walked out to sign for it himself. I held my gaze on the Cardinals. What did he do after he tore it open standing on the porch right where he stood? Nadine's voice was deliberate, each word placed like she'd rehearsed the order in her mind. Walter, I have watched a good many men get difficult news over the years. The color drained from his face, not slow, all in one go, like something behind his eyes just switched off. My chest went tight. I pressed my spare hand flat on the countertop to hold myself steady. He went through it twice, Nadine said. Then he turned and went back in. 5 minutes or so later, Celeste appeared at the door. She'd read something in his face, and he put the letter in her hands. I watched her go through it. And Walter, I wasn't close enough to read her expression, but I had a clear line through the glass. The moment she finished, her whole body locked up differently, went rigid right through the shoulders, visible from 2 houses off. That's what it looks like when something lands wrong on a person the shoulders seize. She got a few words in, then turned and went back inside, and that was that. Said something to Aaron. I never caught what. Then Glenda showed up, called it within the hour practically. I watched her pull in. She stayed 45 minutes. A pause then. When she came out, she wasn't wearing a pleasant expression. I nearly spoke up right then, but Nadine had more. Walter, there's something I want you to look at. Mind if I swing by Clifford's this afternoon? She was there by 3 on her phone in hand. We settled at Clifford's kitchen table with Buck lying between us on the floor, his tail making a slow, lazy sweep. Nadine brought up the video she'd put out on a Charlotte community Facebook group 3 weeks back. I'd been aware she filmed it. I knew it had gone up, but I hadn't sat down and watched it. She held the phone across the table. I took it from her. 40 seconds. Filmed from Dana's porch in the rain. A little unsteady the way any video shot in the dark and wet tends to be. But it was clear. Clear enough that the porch light above the door came through. Clear enough to watch the door swing open. Clear enough to see a blue suitcase lowered onto the front walk. Clear enough to make out an old man in a flannel shirt, stooping to take hold of it. A dog tucked against his leg. Rain working over both of them. Clear enough to watch that door pull shut. I sat with it once through. My throat locked up so hard I had to swallow 3 times just to trust my own breath. The heat hit my eyes fast and sharp, and I didn't fight it this time. I let it rise and blinked it back and stayed with the screen. That man in the rain, that was me. 72 years old, out on a wet porch with a suitcase and a dog, and no place lined up the door going closed at his back, the way a sentence ends when there's nothing left to add and it's been building a long time. How many people have seen it? My voice had some gravel in it. And last I checked, Nadine said her voice gone soft as I'd ever heard it, a little over 80,000. The phone went down on the table. Nadine laid her hand over mine. Warm, dry, steady, the hand of a woman who'd put a husband in the ground, brought up 3 kids, and still made a point of being present when presence was what mattered. It's all right, she said. Let people see it. My phone buzzed where it sat. Adriana's name on the screen. I pulled up the message. Walter Aaron's colleagues are running across the video. His name turned up in the public court filing as well, just this morning. I'm hearing from his attorney's side that there's an appetite to talk. Do not take any calls from Aaron himself. Root it all through me. I read through it twice and set the phone face down on the table. Then it rang anyway. Even turned face down, the glow leaked out around the edges. I flipped it. Aaron. His name on the screen pulsing with each ring. 3, 4. I looked at it the way a man looks at something that once held all the meaning in the world, and now holds something else, not less of it, just different with more weight to it. Nadine didn't say a word. She didn't move to guide me. That was always her way. She believed a man ought to come to his own conclusions in his own time. The 5th ring ended, and the phone went quiet. I laid it back down face to the table. Not yet, I said, and I kept my voice low. Nadine answered with one slow nod, as if that was the only sensible response. Buck pressed his head into my knee, solid and warm, and I rested my hand across his back and let his breathing carry me for a while, as the kitchen found its quiet again. But on the other side of Charlotte, my son had just placed an empty box on a parking garage floor and made his way to his car by himself. That was something I didn't know yet. It would take Adriana's call the next morning to bring it to me. Still that old instinct, the one that always knew where the grain would split before the crack showed itself, It was already reading the signs. Adriana rang on a Monday morning, first week of December. Through Clifford's kitchen window, Charlotte had at last surrendered to winter. The trees lining the street were stripped bare dark shapes against a sky the color of old pewter, and there was a coldness in the air that went beyond temperature, the kind that works its way into old joints and takes up residence. I'd been awake since 5, same as always, but I hadn't made it out to the workshop. Something had held me at the kitchen table with my coffee waiting in that particular way. A man waits when he knows a call is coming and isn't sure he's ready to receive it. When the phone went off and Adriana's name appeared on the screen, I had it to my ear before the second ring died. Walter. Her voice carried its usual measured quality, but something lived underneath it this time. Not quite satisfaction, more like the sound of a door swinging open that no one would be able to push shut again. It's happening. My grip on the phone went tight. Tell me. Aaron was let go from his position this morning. She gave it a single beat, just enough room for that to settle. His firm, a financial investment company over in Uptown, keeps a compliance team whose job is watching public court filings for employee names. When we filed the civil complaint last week, it entered the public record. They had it within 48 hours. I drew a slow breath through my nose, reached for my coffee and found it had gone cold. I hadn't even registered it until that moment. The video made its way through their office as well, Adriana went on. Several colleagues forwarded it internally. Combined with the court filing, their compliance department opened an internal review. A pause. Aaron was let go from Coastal Capital Group this morning. They cited a violation of their public compliance and code of conduct policies. Once that civil filing became public record, they had grounds enough to move. What they found on their own, internally, I can't say, and honestly, we don't need to know. What matters is that this was their call made on the basis of public information. We didn't go to his employer. The court filing did that work by existing. They didn't even need the fraud charge, I said slowly. No, Adriana said. They went through their own internal policy. That's cleaner for them and for us, frankly. We didn't set this off. The filing was public record and they found it themselves. Her voice stayed careful and exact. I want to be clear with you about that, Walter. What we did was file a legal civil complaint. Everything that followed the job, the compliance review that was a consequence built out of Aaron's own decisions. Not something we arranged. I knew she was right. I knew it the way a man knows things in his mind. But there's a difference between the head knowing something and the chest carrying it. Right then, my chest felt like it had something heavy laid across it. He walked out of there this morning, I said. Not a question. Security escorted him out, as is standard when a financial firm terminates for compliance reasons, she said. A pause. Walter, how are you holding up? Clifford had come into the kitchen somewhere in the middle of that call. He'd read my face and gone still over by the counter, not crowding me, not retreating, just present the way he had always managed to be. I looked across the room at him, and he looked back with those quiet eyes that never pushed for anything. I'll reach out if I need you, Adriana, I said. Thank you? I set the phone on the table. Then I got up, crossed to the back door, and walked out onto Clifford's rear porch. The cold came at me immediately sharp, clean, the kind that cuts through everything, and forces a kind of clarity whether you've asked for it or not. I stood there in my flannel shirt with both hands on the railing, looking out over the bare tree line, and I thought about my son. Not the 44-year-old man who'd stood in a hallway and told me to take my dog and get out. The boy. The one who used to climb up onto the stool beside my workbench at 5 years old and fire questions at me I could barely keep up with. The one who sobbed when our first dog died and tried to hide it, because he figured I'd tell him Pruitt men didn't do that. And I never had said that, not once. But he feared it just the same. The boy who had driven out of Avery County with everything ahead of him and my life savings behind him, like a hand at his back. My eyes went hot. I let them. The cold air pulled the sting right out. Clifford came through the door and took his place at the railing beside me, shoulder to shoulder, staring out at the same bare trees. He lost his job, I said. The words came out low and scraped like they had been dragged across something rough. Yes, Clifford said. I never wanted that for him. I know you didn't. I tightened my grip on the railing. The wood was cold under my palms, painted porch wood, not the quality I'd have chosen, but solid enough to hold a man up. I just wanted him to understand what he did. That was all. Just wanted him to look at it square. Clifford turned his head toward me a degree or two. Walter, his voice dropped low. You filed a legal document. Everything that came after the job, the public record, the video. None of that is something you did to him. That is what his own choices constructed one on top of another over a long stretch of time. You just stopped standing in front of it. I kept my eyes on the trees for a long moment. A crow dropped down onto the highest branch of the farthest oak and perched there black against the pewter sky, watching whatever crows watch. I keep seeing him at 8 years old, I said. My voice split right down the middle, and I let it, sitting on that stool in my workshop, asking me why cherrywood smells like his grandmother's kitchen. A sound came up out of my throat, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else, but living somewhere in the space between. How does a boy like that arrive at a place like this? Clifford held his quiet for a moment. Then, same way most of them do, Walter, one small decision at a time. One thing they told themselves was all right when it wasn't. One door they passed through and never looked back at. He set his hand on my shoulder, brief and firm. That's not something you put on yourself. I dragged the back of my hand across my face. Buck had nosed the back door open and materialized beside me, pressing his warm bulk against my leg. I reached down and rested my hand on his head. There's more coming, isn't there? I said. It wasn't a question. Usually is, Clifford said. But you've got solid people around you, and you've got that dog. Something close to a smile crossed my face. Close. Back inside, I poured the cold coffee out and started a fresh pot. Outside Charlotte's first December sky sat heavy and gray and still, and the bare trees held themselves up inside it, the way old things learn to hold themselves through hard weather, not by fighting it, just by standing. The last thing Clifford said to me that evening, as I set my chisel down and watched the sawdust drift and settle on the workbench floor, was this: Walter, sometimes a man has to lose everything before he understands what he actually had. I didn't have an answer for that right away. I just picked up a rag, wiped my hands down slow, and thought about my son. 3 days had gone by since Adriana had called to tell me Aaron had been let go from Coastal Capital Group. 3 days of nothing, no calls, no texts, not even a word from Nadine about spotting his car in the neighborhood. Just silence. The heavy, suffocating variety that descends when something large is gathering itself to break. It broke on a Thursday morning. My phone buzzed on the nightstand at 7. Aaron's name on the screen, and my heart did something it hadn't managed in weeks. It lurched upward like a man snatching at a rope he wasn't certain would bear his weight. I answered on the second ring. Dad. His voice cracked clean through the middle of that single word. Just Dad. And packed inside those 3 letters I could hear 3 months of pressure and humiliation and nights without sleep. I'm here, I said, and pushed myself upright my back, complaining the way it does in the cold. She's gone. His breath came in short, broken pulls. Celeste, she loaded up Owen's things last night while I was in the shower. I came out and the suitcases were waiting by the door. I asked her what she thought she was doing, and she said his voice fractured further. She said she didn't sign up to go down with a sinking ship. I pressed my palm flat against my chest and felt my own heartbeat knocking there. Lord have mercy. Where did she go? I asked, keeping my voice level for him, the way you hold a light steady so the other person can find their footing. Her mother's place. Glenda's. He let out a laugh, hollow and dry, not a trace of warmth in it. You know what's funny? Dad, Glenda never liked me. From the day Celeste brought me home, that woman looked at me like something she'd rather not have touched. And now Celeste was running back to her with my son. Owen is her son too, I said gently, because it was the truth and because Aaron needed something true right then. I know that. His voice dropped to almost nothing. I know, I walked into his room this morning and his stuffed bear was still on the bed. She left it behind. She left Benny behind. A sound came out of him, then raw and wrecked. And I knew he wasn't weeping over a stuffed toy. He was weeping over all of it, every last piece of it. I gripped the phone harder. My eyes burned something fierce, but I held on. Aaron, I said after a moment, are you safe? Is there food in the house? I have half a bottle of bourbon and some crackers, he admitted. That's not food, son. That's a bad decision sitting there waiting on you. I swung my legs off the side of the bed, feet meeting the cold floor. You call your doctor today. You hear me? Not tomorrow. Today. Dad, I'm not asking. My voice came out with more edge than I'd aimed for, but it needed to. You're my son, and I won't sit here and let you come apart without at least reaching out my hand. Call your doctor, get yourself dressed, eat something real. A long silence stretched across the line. Then, why are you being kind to me? That question nearly broke something open in me. Nearly. My jaw tightened. The old grief and anger surged up in my chest like water rising behind a dam, and I swallowed it back down because this wasn't the moment for it. "Because you're my blood," I said quietly. "That doesn't switch off just because things went wrong." He broke down then, not the composed, held-together kind of crying. The other kind. The kind that comes from so far down inside a person it tears right through every wall they spent years building. I stayed on the line. I didn't tell him everything would be fine. I made no promises I had no way of keeping. I just stayed there. When at last he went quiet, I heard him pull in a long, shaking breath. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." I sat staring at the wall of Clifford's guest room. Outside the window, a cardinal vivid red against the flat gray of the December sky landed on a fence post and cocked its head to one side as if it was listening in. "I know you are," I said, and I meant every word of it. But I also understood that sorry on its own can't mend a broken foundation. It never could. A man can be the most genuinely repentant person in the world and still carry a debt that words alone won't settle. That's something 40 years of woodworking had taught me, as plain as anything. If you split a plank by driving a nail wrong, apologizing to the wood doesn't make it whole. You still have to do the work. The hearing is next week, I told him, because he needed to know it was bearing down on him. "Adriana will be there. I'll be there." His breath caught sharp. "Dad, I didn't bring that lawsuit to destroy you, Aaron. I brought it because what was done was wrong, and I need you to know the difference between those two things." He didn't push back. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe for the first time in months, the fog of Celeste's pull had thinned just enough for him to see the shape of things clearly. Nadine rang me that afternoon. She'd driven past the Foxcroft house earlier in the day, she said, and found a moving van sitting along the curb. Two men in gray uniforms working through the rooms, a dresser, a child's bookshelf, boxes stacked 4 high. She didn't waste any time, Nadine said, and her voice had that particular edge of a woman who has been close to betrayal before and knows what it looks like when it moves fast. "No," I agreed, watching Buck stretch out at my feet, his old golden tail making slow sweeps across the hardwood. She never did. That night I sat in Clifford's armchair with Buck's head heavy across my lap and a cup of tea gone cold on the side table. I thought about Aaron alone in that big silent house, Owen's stuffed bears still sitting on the bed. I thought about how a man can spend his whole life building something, a family, a name, a sense of what he's made of, and not understand how fast it can splinter until the moment it does. I scratched Buck behind his ear, and he let out a long, satisfied sigh. Next week, I thought, the hearing. I have been inside a great many buildings in my 72 years, tobacco warehouses in Avery County that smelled of cured leaves and old timber, hospital hallways that hummed under fluorescent lights and carried a quiet kind of dread, churches where the air itself seemed to hold still. But I had never stood in a courtroom before the morning of December 19th, 2023. Mecklenburg County Superior Court sits in downtown Charlotte, a building of pale stone and tall windows that makes no effort to disguise what it is. There is something about a courthouse, the way the ceilings climb too high above you, the way every footfall echoes off the marble floor, that leaves a man feeling both very small and oddly sharp at the same time. Adriana met me on the front steps at 8:15, a leather briefcase in hand that looked like it had traveled through 100 rooms exactly like this one. She shook my hand firmly, her dark eyes calm and steady behind wire-rimmed glasses. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like a man who has no business being here," I told her. She gave me a small, measured smile. "You belong here exactly as much as the truth belongs here, and today the truth has very good documentation." She patted her briefcase. "Let's go." Clifford drove me. He settled in the back of the courtroom, with his hands folded in his lap and his chin held up slightly, the way a man sits when he wants everyone present to know he has no shame about where he is or who he's standing beside. When I looked back at him just before taking my seat next to Adriana, he gave me one slow, deliberate nod. "I'm here." Aaron arrived 7 minutes after we did. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive clothes fit a man who has dropped weight loose through the shoulders, the collar sitting just a fraction too wide. He looked like sleep had not found him in days. The skin beneath his eyes was dark and sunken, and when he lowered himself into the chair at the opposite table beside his attorney, a man Adriana would later tell me was named Boyd Kavanaugh, he didn't look up. Not at me, not at anyone. Boyd Kavanaugh was polished in the manner defense attorneys sometimes are silver cufflinks, a practiced ease in every movement, a voice built to sound measured, even when the facts beneath it weren't. He opened by arguing that the $47,000 Walter had provided was a gift, a father's willing contribution to his son's future, and that no enforceable obligation to repay it had ever existed. Adriana didn't flinch. She rose, gave her jacket one small, precise tug, and said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff holds a promissory note bearing the defendant's signature, dated April 14th, 2023, witnessed by Nadine Beckett of Avery County, North Carolina. The note specifies the principal amount of $47,000. The purpose of the loan, to serve as a down payment on a residential property at 312 Harrington Place, Charlotte, North Carolina, and the repayment condition, quote, to be repaid in full upon demand or upon sale of the property, whichever occurs first. This is not a gift. This is a documented, witnessed, legally binding loan." She set the note on the clerk's desk with the quiet confidence of a person laying down an ace. Judge Stuart Halford was a man in his late 60s, heavy-set reading glasses, sitting low on his nose, and the expression of someone who has heard every version of every story there is, and stopped being surprised by any of them long ago. He examined the promissory note at length, turning the page, drawing his finger along Aaron's signature. "Boyd Kavanaugh." "Try it again." "Your Honor, the language of the document is ambiguous." "Mr. Kavanaugh." Judge Halford looked up over his glasses. "The document states to be repaid in full upon demand. A demand letter was sent by certified mail on November 28th. The defendant did not respond within the 30-day window. I don't find the language ambiguous." My hands were shaking in my lap. I pressed them flat against my thighs. Adriana continued. She placed before the court the bank statement showing the exact $47,000 transfer out of Walter's account, proceeds from the Avery County land sale into Aaron's personal checking account on April 15th, one day after the note was signed. She then presented the mortgage application for 312 Harrington Place, in which Aaron had listed the $47,000 as a personal gift rather than a loan. She laid it out for Judge Halford in plain, unhurried language that misrepresenting a loan as a gift on a residential mortgage application constitutes a material misstatement under federal lending guidelines, a matter she had reserved the right to refer to the appropriate authorities separately should the defendant fail to satisfy today's judgment. At that, Aaron's jaw tightened visibly. His attorney bent close and said something urgent and low. Aaron shook his head, a short, rigid motion. In addition, the plaintiff had been named in a co-guarantor letter submitted to the lender at the time of the original application, the document that helped establish the down payment funds as legitimate. His name was removed from that letter roughly 6 weeks after closing, through a filing processed without his written acknowledgement. That removal, handled quietly through the lender's administrative channel, constitutes a breach of good faith in the original transaction, and further demonstrates the defendant's deliberate effort to erase the plaintiff's documented standing. The courtroom went very still. The ventilation system hummed somewhere above the ceiling tiles. I could feel Clifford's steady presence at my back. I fixed my eyes on the wood grain of the table in front of me and breathed. Judge Halford set down his reading glasses and looked directly across the room at Aaron. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, and his tone was not unkind, but it carried no give in it whatsoever. "Do you dispute the authenticity of the promissory note?" Aaron's throat moved. He looked down at the table for a beat, then brought his eyes back up to the judge. "No, Your Honor," he said. His voice barely reached across the room. "I don't." Boyd Kavanaugh closed his eyes briefly the way a man does when he hears a door swing shut for good. Judge Halford ruled in my favor. Judgment for the plaintiff, $47,000 its principal plus statutory interest at the applicable rate from the date of demand, November 28, 2023, and partial attorney's fees. Aaron had 90 days to satisfy the judgment, or Adriana could move to enforce it through wage garnishment, a property line, or forced sale. When the gavel came down, the sound of it passed through me like a low note struck on a church organ, not triumphant, not joyful, but final, the way a closing hymn feels when something has been named and laid to rest. I turned to Adriana. My eyes were burning. I pressed my lips together and gave a single nod because words had gone somewhere I couldn't reach just then. She placed her hand briefly on my arm. "You did good, Walter. Out in the hallway, marble floors echoing with footsteps, the tall windows letting gray winter light spill across everything. I looked back toward the courtroom doors. Aaron came through them. A moment later, Boyd Kavanaugh close at his side, speaking in a low, pressing voice. Aaron wasn't listening. He stood there in the middle of that corridor, people moving around him in both directions, and he looked at me. Just looked. His face carried something I hadn't seen on him in years. Something stripped down and undefended. Something that lay underneath all the wreckage, like the boy who used to fall asleep against the truck window on the drive home from Little League. Clifford appeared at my shoulder and put a hand there, warm, steadying. "You ready to go home?" I took one last look at my son in that courthouse hallway, the fluorescent light falling hard and unforgiving across his face. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'm ready." But even as I turned away, I knew the way you know a storm is building by the shift in the air, that this wasn't finished between Aaron and me. The judgment was handed down. The law had done what law can do. What came next was something no courtroom on earth has the authority to settle. He showed up on a Tuesday afternoon 4 days before Christmas. I heard the knock from the kitchen, where I was sanding the edge of a small oak side table Clifford had asked me to finish. 3 knocks, firm but uncertain. The kind of knock a man makes when he isn't sure he has the right to be standing at that door at all. I set down the sandpaper. My chest went tight in a way I knew immediately. Buck heard it too. He raised his big golden head off his paws, ears up, and let out a single soft sound, not a bark, not a growl, just a low note of recognition from somewhere deep in his throat. Then he was on his feet and moving toward the front door faster than I'd seen him move in, months his whole hindquarters working with the effort. I followed him. When I pulled the door open, Aaron was on the porch steps with his hands shoved into the pockets of a gray jacket too thin for December. He'd shed more weight. His face was drawn, cheekbones sharper, the lines around his eyes deeper than any 44-year-old man's ought to be. But his eyes were clear, not the flat-guarded look he'd carried in that courthouse hallway. Clear like a window someone had finally thrown open after a long winter of keeping it shut. Before I could get a word out, Buck shouldered past my legs and pressed his nose straight into Aaron's knee. Aaron's composure broke all at once. His face crumpled, and he went down on one knee right there on the porch steps, pulling both arms around Buck's neck and burying his face in that old golden fur. His shoulders heaved. He wept the way a man weeps when he has been holding something far too heavy for far too long. Not quietly, not with any dignity, but from so deep inside it shook his whole frame. My eyes burned so hard, I had to grip the door frame to hold myself upright. "He doesn't hold it against you," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I'd meant it to. Aaron pulled back just enough to look up at me, his face wet, his eyes red and raw. "He should," he said, his voice barely keeping its shape. "After everything I did, everything we did, he should." "Dogs don't work that way," I said. "Neither does God, I'm told." I pushed the screen door open wider. "Come inside. It's cold." He got to his feet slowly, one hand still resting on Buck's back like he needed something solid beneath it. He came inside without another word. I poured 2 cups of coffee, strong black, the way Lorene always made it, and put them on Clifford's kitchen table. Aaron wrapped both hands around his cup and stared down into it like a man trying to read something written in the dark. "I didn't come to argue the judgment," he said quietly. "I know," I said, "and I didn't come to ask you to drop anything. Adriana made it clear that ship has sailed." He let out a slow breath. "I came because," his voice gave way. He pressed his lips hard together, jaw working against it. "I came because I need you to know that I know what I did. Not just legally, not just the money. I know what I did to you as a person. As my father, something shifted in my chest. Some tightness that had been living there a long time, beginning very slowly to ease. Celeste made it easy." He went on, and his voice took on a sharper edge, the edge of a man honest enough to stop running from the truth, even while he's explaining it. "She made it easy to tell myself you'd understand, that you'd want this for us, that it wasn't really a loan, it was family, and family doesn't always need paperwork." He shook his head, his expression hardening with self-disgust. "But I knew better, Dad. I knew better the night you signed that note. I understood what that land meant to you. I knew it was the last piece of ground Mama ever walked on, and I took it from you anyway." The mention of Lorene hit me like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. My throat ached. I drew a slow breath through my nose and set my coffee cup down with care. "You want to know what hurt me most?" I said. It wasn't the money. I've worked without money before. A Pruitt man knows how to do that. It wasn't the house or the land either. It was the night you handed me that suitcase. I looked straight at him, and I needed him to take in every word. You handed me that suitcase and told me to take my dog and get out. And you said it like I was a stranger, like 72 years of living, 40 years of sacrifice, a whole lifetime of loving you, like none of it had ever happened. Aaron's face fell to pieces. He pressed one hand over his mouth. His whole body shook. The tears came without ceremony and without restraint, and he made no move to stop them. He sat at that kitchen table and let everything he'd been carrying for months come out of him at once. And Buck, who had settled at his feet the moment we sat down, laid his chin on Aaron's shoe and held very still. I let him cry. I didn't try to move him along. I didn't tell him it was fine. When he finally raised his head and dragged the back of his hand across his face, I leaned forward and said it steadily and plainly. I forgive you, Aaron. I want you to know that. I forgive you because you are my son, and because hatred is a weight I'm too old and too worn down to keep hauling around. I held his gaze a moment longer. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending none of this happened. The judgment stands. The debt is real. And if you want a relationship with me, a genuine one, we build it from the ground up from truth. No shortcuts taken. Nothing papered over. His chin trembled as he nodded. I know, he whispered. I know, Dad. I don't know if you'll ever be able to trust me again. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. An old carpenter's hand, rough and scarred and marked by decades of work. And I said, that part's yours to earn. It's not mine to hand you. He stayed close to an hour. We didn't untangle everything. We didn't put it all right. But when he walked out to his car in the fading afternoon light and turned back once at the end of the driveway, I lifted my hand. He lifted his. It wasn't a resolution. It was a beginning. January arrived quietly that year. Not the crushing stillness of that October night, the suitcase, the dog, the rain. Not that kind, the other kind of quiet, the kind carrying cold pine and wood smoke on it, the kind that only reaches a man after the storm has finally blown itself out. Clifford's workshop had become mine in every practical sense. He'd given me the corner beside the big south-facing window, the best morning light in the place, and told me to make use of it for as long as I needed. I was working on a rocking chair. White oak hand joinery, no nails. The way my grandfather taught me, back before I was tall enough to see over a workbench. The chair wasn't intended for any particular person, which is, I've come to understand, the freest way a craftsman can ever work. Buck slept in a patch of winter sun on the floor, his old golden coat rising and falling, like something settled and permanent. Nadine stopped by on a Wednesday morning with a tin of oatmeal cookies and the look of a woman who is carrying news and means to put it down. Adriana called me, she said, dropping into the spare chair beside my bench. Aaron made his first payment toward the judgment on time, full installment. I kept my plane moving along the grain slow and steady. Good, I said. Nadine raised an eyebrow. That's all you've got? I looked up and felt the corner of my mouth pull towards something that wasn't quite a smile but was close enough to count. Nadine, a man can only sustain so many dramatic emotions before his heart files for early retirement. She laughed full and genuine, and Buck's tail knocked twice against the floorboards without him cracking an eye open. Pastor Hale came by that afternoon, thinner than I remembered, moving with care the way a man moves after his body has taught him to pay attention. He stood in the workshop doorway for a moment, taking in the tools hung on the wall, the shavings on the floor, the half-finished chair holding the pale winter light. You look like yourself again, he said, and that was all. We drank coffee. He asked about Aaron. I told him about the visit before Christmas. The porch steps, Buck pressing into Aaron's knee. The kitchen table, the tears that neither of us tried to stop. Like setting down something you've been hauling too long, I said. My arms can rest now. Pastor Hale turned his mug in his hand slowly. The hardest thing about loving someone is letting them stand in front of what they have earned. You did that, Walter. Most men can't bring themselves to. My eyes burned. I fixed my gaze on the grain of the workbench until the feeling passed. After he left, I went back to the chair. Buck padded over and pressed his warm side flush against my leg, trusting fully without condition the way he has done every day for 11 years. I thought about Lorene, about the land, about a boy running barefoot across a North Carolina yard, calling my name before supper. Love doesn't vanish when it's been bruised. It goes underground instead, like roots in a hard winter waiting for the earth to soften again. Outside Clifford's window, the January sky was clear and cold and wide open. The kind of sky that makes no promises but holds everything beneath it just the same, that I thought was more than enough. If I've learned anything from all of it, the land sale, the suitcase, the rain, the courtroom, the rocking chair, it's that love without boundaries isn't love. It's a slow habit of erasing yourself until there's nothing left to offer. I used to believe that a good father gives everything and asks for nothing in return. I was wrong about that. A good father gives, honestly asks clearly, and trusts that the people he loves are strong enough to bear the truth. I should have spoken sooner. I should have said plainly this is a loan, and I expect it to be honored, not because I needed the money returned, but because respect is built in the small, honest moments long before the large ones come apart and break you. Don't do what I did. Don't let love make you invisible. Don't sign over the last piece of ground your wife ever walked on and call it a gift when your heart knows it isn't. The Bible says the truth will set you free. And I'll tell you, standing in that courthouse with Adriana beside me and Buck waiting at home, I finally understood what that freedom feels like. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this, I'm grateful, truly. This story asked a lot of Walter of Aaron and maybe of you too. Looking back on all of it, the land, the eviction, the rain, the courtroom, the rocking chair, what strikes me most is how long a man can go, telling himself that giving without limit is the same as loving. Well, it isn't. Every dollar, every acre, every silent sacrifice has a cost. And I believe God puts people in our lives, a Clifford and Adriana, a Nadine, not by accident, but because we were never meant to carry the weight alone. The Lord's timing is rarely the timing we'd choose, but it is almost never wrong. Here is what this family revenge story taught me, and what I hope it leaves with you. Don't let love make you invisible. Giving without honesty isn't generosity, it's a slow erasure of yourself. Set the terms clearly and set them early. A loan is a loan. Respect is built in the small, honest moments before the big ones break you. When the truth finally surfaces, let it stand on its own. You don't need to engineer the consequences. Documented truth has a way of doing that work itself. And for those of us in the adults, 50-plus season of life, your dignity, your history, your sacrifice, these are not debts owed to anyone. Hold on to them. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me what you took from it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, because the next one is coming, and I'd like you to be there for it. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.